I will do a presentation of some issues that I find very worrying and that I have not really been giving many talks about before. So let me see how this works. The title is there, Physical, Biological and Social Risks Associated with Solar Radiation Modification. And social is really, I say it up front, very broad. It includes ethics as well, and just many different aspects how people would be affected if solar radiation management was something that was seriously deployed. But briefly, just as a reminder for you, climate change is not slowing down, and so we need to talk about this, of course. This is a way to look at the temperature curve of the last 50 years. And one thing that comes up, if we look a little bit at this trend, then we see that even though the long-term trend is around 0.19 degrees centigrade per decade, for the last 15 years or so, it's about up to 0.3. We see a lot of talk around the COPs and about stabilizations and bending the curve. The physical Earth system does not really see anything of this yet. And another, I put the year 78 in there for telling you also that this is about the time since I have been interested in this, since I've been a student, and I don't take it all on my shoulders, but I think it's a serious failure of us as a community, particularly the older ones among us, that we have not been able to do anything despite many, many thousands of people trying to work and inform the public about it. Another factor that is, of course, accelerating is sea level rise, and we know why. We have not only the data and the observations that it's roughly doubled over the last 30 years, the rate of sea level rise, but we know why it is. It's because of Greenland and probably also Antarctica very soon, and this is one of the topics where we even see the risk of a major tipping point being passed during the coming years or decade. And then a last picture indicating what this all means, this change in the Earth system. It does, of course, mean suffering. I remind you of the word of President Obama's advisor, who said that for looking at climate change, we only have three options. We either reduce emissions, or we increase adaptation, or we suffer. And the choice between those three is one that is being made by policymakers every day and every year, and at every failed climate COP. If you want to see who are the people who are at greatest risk to fall into the suffering category, those are the 3.3 to 3.6 billion people that are indicated on this map. And I won't go into the details of it, but why are there the blue points? The blue points are indicating all those people, those communities that are particularly vulnerable, that are not perhaps necessarily indicated by the red intensity colors. There's sometimes also in the north and on small islands and elsewhere, but this is what the map is trying to say. And so the question is, if we have failed over those 30 years to actually manage our emissions in a way that would have avoided the problems that we've run in so far, maybe we should turn to our engineers and ask them if they cannot really help us fix the problem in a different way. And there's a number of techniques that are now being considered and proposed, all falling into a broad category of techniques that we call geoengineering. I won't cover them all. Actually, I will very soon only talk about one of them. But there's a broad package of techniques, and what the message I do not want to make today is that we should just discard them all. There's a number of them that merit our attention and that we will probably need to make some use of. But there are some that are downright dangerous and that we really need to talk a little bit more about. Among the most prominent groups of geoengineering techniques, there's a carbon dioxide removal, which means actively pulling out CO2 or other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And there are those that concern solar radiation, that basically accept the idea that we have greenhouse gases increasing, but maybe we can somehow deal with the radiation balance in the atmosphere, and therefore, despite growing greenhouse gas concentrations, maybe maybe avoid some of the warming, or reduce or even reverse some of the warming. And there are basically 4 different types of solar radiation management. There's what we call marine cloud brightening. I will not talk about that today. There's potential ways to thin the cirrus clouds in the atmosphere. I won't talk about that either. And then there are many ways to enhance surface albedos, the reflectivity of the land surface towards the atmosphere. I won't talk about that either. But what I want to talk about is stratospheric aerosol injection, because that's the one that's coming up on the agenda, has come up over the last 5 or 6 years. Just one historical glimpse. One of the, I would say, greatest climatologists of the early days, the Russian Mikhail Buydiko, wrote actually about almost everything I'm going to say already back in 1974. It's quite amazing to look this up, because it also has been translated, and this is just taken from a small chapter in the book. He says, let us consider the possibility of changing climatic conditions by increasing the concentration of aerosol particles in the lower stratosphere. And I won't read it all, but he works it out in details and even with numbers. And he says we would need about 40,000 tons of sulfur per year, which we need to somehow get into the atmosphere. And if we did that, then in his calculation, we would be able to reverse the warming of the planet correspondingly to what had been observed between the 1920s and 1930s. That was his perspective. But he went even as far as saying that in 1974, that modern high-altitude aircraft carrying a load of about 15 tons can reach the level of the aerosol layer. And therefore, we can actually do it. It's a limited number of airplanes that are needed, and of course it's all much easier and more powerful today than it was in his days, but it's a real issue that has been on the table for almost 50 years now, And so what we do, of course, solar radiation management or not, we fly crazily around the planet, and we pollute the atmosphere at all levels, in this case at the bottom level, but we also do it in the stratosphere already. This is, of course, not solar radiation management, and I also won't go into the contrails discussion, only if you want to. This just happens to be a picture of an airplane that flew in a situation in the atmosphere where quite a lot of water vapor was created. This is not sulfur or any other particles that are being distributed, but it's a nice illustration. So could this even work? What do we know today about the possibility of doing something like that? Well, we have a tremendous natural experiment. We have many of those, but we had a particular one in 1991 when Mount Pinatubo exploded in the Philippines, because this was in the 20th century the volcano that emitted the largest amount of particles in the stratosphere. And there were a lot of papers written about this, including one that I participated in, where we looked at not just the temperature response, the climatologists had already done that, but where we also looked at the response of the biosphere, in this case at higher latitudes, and we found that there was actually a significant response in the ability of plants to absorb carbon and to function, essentially a reduction in productivity for a few years after that explosion of Pinatubo. And the IPCC helps us understand this, or summary our understanding. This is what we call the radiative forcing, the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb radiation in such a way that the planet is warming. We know the largest part of that is due to carbon dioxide, another part to other greenhouse gases such as methane, and others, ozone, water vapor in the stratosphere. But that's not the whole story. We also have land use change, which is exerting a negative forcing on the radiation balance. So some of our land clearing leads actually to greater reflectivity and therefore less warming than we would get if we would not have had the land use change. And we have aerosols. And aerosols are a big concern even outside the question of solar radiation management. First of all, this graph shows that the current aerosol load in the entire atmosphere is very large, and it actually leads to net cooling. And to tell you the truth, between the coffee break and starting this talk, I noticed that there's a new paper out that explains that the exceptional warming that we had in 2023 is largely now explained by the fact that shipping, global shipping, has had more rigorous rules about aerosol emissions from shipping. And that reduction in aerosol in the atmosphere due to those new rules has contributed to the extra warming. So it's something we understand, and where we actually have this supplementary problem that if we finally clean up our pollution of the atmosphere in terms of aerosols, we will have more warming. It's a separate topic, but it shows, and this diagram illustrates that we understand physically pretty well what aerosol does in the atmosphere, and as you've seen, Budiko already did understand it for some time. So in comes this idea: can we use that knowledge and technology to manipulate the atmosphere? And this has been looked at the first time in a IPCC summary mode in the 2018 report about the possibility or not to keep the atmospheric warming below 1.5 degrees. And the types of scenarios that were calculated for the possibility to actually apply these technologies are long-term scenarios where the assumption was that maybe we go a little bit above 1.5, as this blue curve indicates, and maybe we don't really quite manage to decrease our emissions, so we will have to do something. And so all practical and realistic calculations that were made for solar radiation management, they look like this: that at one point you have to start massively deploying those airplanes and put your particles in the stratosphere, and you will have to do that for some time. And I will be a little bit more specific about that later, but what that graph already shows is if you start doing that, you will have to do it for a very long time, which is one of the considerations that need to be taken into account, among many others, that if we really want to have a serious discussion about that. But first, what are the risks associated with application of this technique? I'm citing IPCC reports here very directly. There will, like with any manipulation of the climate system, and as some people point out, also, of course, with the manipulation through greenhouse gases, the emission of greenhouse gases, there will be a climatic response, and it will not just be a change in the average. It will be actually a very complex response. There will be changes in temperature and precipitation, particularly in some monsoon regions. There will be a decrease in direct and increase in diffuse sunlight at the surface. There will be stratospheric heating. There will be a potential delay in ozone hole recovery, and therefore a change in surface UV radiation. Those things are all from models pretty well understood. And when we look at biological systems, then there will probably be a reduction in biological productivity because there will be less radiation. There will be changes, probably complex changes in the ability of the land to store carbon, and there will be numerous other potential ecosystem changes. Some positive, some negative. They only have in common that they will be very hard to predict. But one thing that is an indirect consequence, and perhaps one of the really dramatic ones that we need to talk about, is that ocean acidification will just continue, because obviously the efforts that you make for managing the stratosphere, that will reduce our efforts in reducing emissions, and therefore atmospheric CO2 concentration will further increase, and the ocean doesn't care about the radiation or anything. It just absorbs the CO2 and acidifies. And therefore, everything we know about impacts of acidification, particularly coral bleaching, will just continue unabated no matter what we do in terms of the upper stratosphere. But there are, beyond these numerous and sometimes difficult to predict risks, there are some spatial and temporal concerns that I want to mention. In the latest IPCC Working 1 report, there was an analysis of what it would look like spatially out of climate models if we just reduce CO2 in terms of global temperature change, relative change, And what happens if instead of reducing CO2, we put aerosols into the stratosphere? And the only thing this really shows is that the pattern is not quite the same. We get more impacts in the north, of course, as we should expect, but it will not be quite the same. And this is already asking the question, those who live in areas where these maps do not coincide, do they get the choice to decide whether they want rather the CO2 reduction or want rather the solar radiation management? Obviously they don't. And if we look at the same maps in terms of the precipitation pattern, which for a large part of the world is a more crucial quantity than its temperature, then you see it's almost all over the place. First of all, there's great uncertainty, and certainly there are winners and losers. There are regions that have more rainfall and regions that have less rainfall, and well, I come back to the decision-making and governance aspects that are there. A further aspect of the temporal development is that actually, if you start doing this is all the existing model calculations that exist confirm this. It will take about 2 decades before you even detect that it works. This is because the climate system is a very dynamic system that has high levels of variability. So imagine you start something and you only know 20 years down the road whether it actually had an impact and what that impact was. That was a discovery for me, that this is, there are even some calculations where they say if we start today, before the end of the century we will not really know what it has done. And the other thing I already mentioned is that once you started, you have to go for at least 100 years. There are some calculations that you actually have to rather count on 300 or 400 years, depending also on the rest of your climate efforts. This is not a short-term action that you can do to fix something. And what is mentioned here as the termination shock, that is the question that if for any reason, on one day somebody says, okay, we cannot have this program anymore, those planes, we cannot fly them anymore because we have a global economic crisis or some other reason, then basically you get back all the global warming that you have been avoiding over the years of the deployment of your solar radiation management. You will get it back in some very few years and in some very drastic and sudden mode. So that sudden termination is something that has been known for a while, and that is also part of the concern. So let's come briefly to the economic and social and ethical concerns. First of all, it's not just engaged scientists and IPCC authors that are beginning to be concerned. Industry itself is beginning to be concerned, and one sector of industry is insurance. The insurance industry, Swiss Re in this case, they have developed a very clear report explaining why they, under no circumstances, want to see anything like SRM, where they basically list all the reasons that there are legal and regulatory risks, there are additional potential for international conflict. There's nothing in there that the insurance industry actually likes. And they think that the world is really better for them if there's no SRM being deployed. But then coming back to this question of how to actually manage it in terms of governance. And here I'm using a quote from a pure natural science paper, but I like the way of their dry language to explain this thing. One of the arguably biggest difficulties of SRM deployment is international cooperation and coordination. Maintaining international cooperation will be even more difficult if deployment needs to be sustained over many decades, as the priorities and interests of countries and their leaders might change. A very sort of sober description of the crazy world that we live in, I think. And of course the serious concern that if we decide something, we're not only committing ourselves, we're committing future generations to the maintenance of a system that will be very, very costly to them. So if we look, I'm not a good expert on ethics, but I want to read this short quote from the IPCC last report, because it explains for me rather well in the appropriate language what the ethical concerns are. There's a concern already, that's a partial aspect of this, concern that publicly debating, researching, and potentially deploying SAI is stratospheric aerosol injection, it's the same thing. It could involve a moral hazard with potential to obstruct ongoing and future mitigation options. Said differently, we may be discussing this while in reality all we should ever do is actually bring our emissions down, right? And researchers have started more explicitly considering inequality and participation and inclusion of vulnerable countries and marginalized social groups, including considering stopping research. There is recognition that SIM research has been conducted predominantly by a relatively small number of experts in the global north, and that more can be done to enable participation from diverse peoples and geographies in setting research agendas and research governance priorities, and undertaking research with initial efforts to this effect, noting unequal power relations in participation could influence SIM research governance and potential implications for policy. Very complicated sentence, but you get the idea that at the moment this is something that's basically discussed among a couple of white males in the north, some of them with a lot of money. I'll end this really quick, but I want to make clear that what is the recent status of the debate. So despite the clear warnings expressed by subsequent reports from the IPCC, they are private actors that are preparing substantial initiatives to deploy SIM. And a part of the academic community supports these initiatives, generally without serious consideration of all those governance and ethical issues. And some organizations like UNEP have published what I would call pro-SIM reports, while actually circumnavigating the known expertise on risks concerning SIM, even that one that was made explicit in the IPCC report. Two recent examples, in my view, rather problematic examples. One is the One Atmosphere report from UNEP, from a very selected group at UNEP that have written this without any larger consultation. And the other one is the Climate Overshoot Commission that has also issued very strong statement pro-SIM. On the other side, more than 500 scientists from 60+ countries and numerous different disciplines have actually called for a moratorium. And this is what's called the group that asked for a solar geoengineering non-use agreement. I'm one of the members of this group, and I'm really proud of our list of signatories, because there's really some very important people from the global north and the global south and from many different disciplines on board. And so there's some momentum also in this direction. And I would say in part thanks to that, now a growing number of countries call for an actual stop of experimentation and or deployment of SIM over their territory. The first one was Mexico, who were directly affected by a stupid little attempt by a small American company that was making some completely illegal experiments near the Mexican border. But now also Vanuatu, Djibouti potentially leading a number of African countries, Fiji, Pakistan, Colombia. All of these have not really put this into legislation. I think Mexico has, but the discussion is going on, and I am the first one to encourage these countries. My conclusions. So theoretically, in terms of global average temperature, SIM could reduce global warming. No question about that. We've known it since 1974. But deploying it would require a century-long high financial commitment without a real termination option, except some very complicated phase-out that in itself would also have to take decades. Some world regions might see benefits, but many others will experience additional loss and damage, including the entire region, if you will, of the global ocean. And there is no conceivable fair governance for the deployment, maintenance, and termination of SIM. All options involve even further dominance and control by private or government actors in the global north. And a large community therefore proposes a ban for experimentation, research, and deployment of SIM. And I thank you very much for your attention.